Good evening. Welcome to another in our series on, I was going to say the Gospel of Acts. It's not the Gospel of Acts, it's the Book of Acts. Before we get into these few verses of chapter 18, I'd like to read Psalm 35. Psalm 35, because I think it fits pretty well with what we're going to be talking about with Paul before the proconsul Gallio in Corinth this evening. Psalm 35. Contend, O Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take hold of shield and buckler and rise for my help. Draw the spear and javelin against my pursuers. Say to my soul, I am your salvation. Let them be put to shame and dishonor who seek my life. Let them be turned back and disappointed who devise evil against me. Let them be like chaff before the wind, with the angel of the Lord driving them away. Let their way be dark and slippery, with the angel of the Lord pursuing them. For without cause they hid their feet for me. They hid their net for me. Wow. Without cause they dug a pit for my life. Let destruction come upon him when he does not know it, and let the net that he hid ensnare him. Let him fall into it to his destruction. Then my soul will rejoice in the Lord, exulting in his salvation. All my bones shall say, O Lord, who is like you, delivering the poor from him who is too strong for him, the poor and the needy from him who robs him? Malicious witnesses rise up. They ask me of things that I do not know. They repay me evil for good. My soul is bereft. But I, when they were sick, I wore sackcloth. I afflicted myself with fasting. I prayed with my head bowed on my chest. I went about as though I grieved for a friend or a brother. As one who laments his mother, I bowed down in mourning. But at my stumbling they rejoiced and gathered. They gathered together against me. Wretches whom I did not know tore at me without ceasing. Like profane mockers at a feast, they gnash at me with their teeth. How long, O Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from their destruction, my precious life from the lions. I will thank you in the great congregation, in the mighty throng I will praise you. Let not those rejoice over me who are wrongfully my foes, and let not those who wink the eye, who hate me without cause. For they do not speak peace, but against those who are quiet in the land they devise words of deceit. They open wide their mouths against me, and they say, Aha, aha, our eyes have seen it. You have seen, O Lord. Be not silent. O Lord, be not far from me. Awake and rouse yourself for my vindication, for my cause, my God and my Lord. Vindicate me, O Lord my God, according to your righteousness, and let them not rejoice over me. Let them not say in their hearts, Aha, our soul's desire. Let them not say, We have swallowed him up. Let them be put to shame and disappointment altogether who rejoice at my calamity. Let them be clothed with shame and dishonor who magnify themselves against me. Let those who delight in my righteousness shout for joy and be glad and say forevermore, Great is the Lord who delights in the welfare of his servant. Then my tongue shall tell of your righteousness and of your praise all the day long. As I said, we are in Acts chapter 18. We're going to be doing verses or looking at verses 12 through 17, a really pivotal point in the Achaean ministry, the mission that Paul is doing here in Corinth and that will repeat later when he returns to the area. Let me read the verses and then we'll make a comment or six about them. This is Acts chapter 18, beginning in verse 12. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. This is an interesting section because it introduces a new character to us, Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia. And we need to know who this man is, because once again, Paul finds himself brought up before officials facing accusations. He did in chapter 16, verses 19 to 24, when the owners of the girl who was possessed of the evil spirit was following Paul around and shouting out, "These men are teaching you the way of salvation." When Paul expelled the demon from her, they dragged Paul and Silas before the city authorities, the magistrates, and they were beaten and thrown in prison. In Acts 17 and verse 6, opposition rises up against Paul in Thessalonica, and the crowd, because they can't find Paul or Silas, they drag Jason, the house where Paul had been staying, they drag him before the city authorities in verse 6, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also." And Jason has to put up a bond of security, assuring their good behavior and also assuring that they're going to leave town. In Acts 17, verse 19, Paul is brought before the Areopagus, the high court of Athens, to explain to them the teaching that he's been proclaiming in the marketplace and to just about anybody who will listen to him about Jesus, the Messiah, the God who is raised from the dead. And they have questions for him because the accusation is leveled against him that he is preaching about foreign gods, the charge that was laid at the feet of Socrates. And so the Jews here in Corinth, after some time that Paul has been preaching, remember last week, Paul left the synagogue. He went next door to the synagogue, to the home of Gaius, and is staying there. And many in Corinth are coming to belief in the gospel through his teaching and his preaching because he's now devoted himself full time. Silas and Timothy have come back to him bearing the gifts from Macedonia. And it's substantial enough that Paul is able to support himself because of the congregation's generosity and go about preaching full time. He is focused on doing nothing but teaching about Jesus and saying that Jesus is the Christ. And many are coming to belief. And he has this encouraging vision from Jesus that says, "Don't be afraid. I have a lot of people in this city." He also says in verse 10, "I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you." Hold that thought in your mind. Gallio. Gallio is an interesting character here. Gallio, uh, born roughly 5 BC, lived to 65 AD. He was born, his name when he was born was Marcus Aeneas Novatus. Uh, he was born in what is now Cordova, Spain. And he was the son of Marcus Aeneas Seneca, who was an elder statesman from Spain, who, when they moved to Rome, became one of the leading officials in Rome. Gallio has, I was going to say either a younger or older brother, but I don't know that there's a third choice. He's not a twin. He has a brother. His brother, Lucius Aeneas Seneca, who was a very famous Stoic philosopher. I have quoted from the works of Seneca, I believe, in the study of Acts and other books that I've taught, because Seneca is one of those leading writers whose works have survived to this day from the period of time in which Paul is living and the New Testament events are taking place. He's the brother of this well-known philosopher. And when the family moved from Spain to Rome, uh, his name was changed to Lucius Junius Gallio. And so it's this man who was appointed by Tiberius Caesar to be proconsul of the province of Achaia. Seneca, his brother, was the tutor to the future Roman Emperor Nero, which is kind of ironic because Nero had Seneca and Gallio both executed in AD 65. After Nero had ascended the throne, he developed a wee bit of paranoia and executed just about anybody who might have any ties to him that they could use to manipulate him or hold sway over him, or whom he perceived was a threat to his position. If you looked at him cross-eyed, you were in a lot of trouble. So Gallio is appointed the proconsul of Achaia, and he takes office on July 1st, 51 AD, because that's when the offices of government would change over, was in July. Paul has probably been in Corinth now for 8 or 9 months, and he's been having an extremely successful ministry. Here comes the new guy in town, this Roman official. And it's at that moment that the Jews decide they're going to, verse 12, they made a united attack on Paul. That's the English Standard Version. The NIV says, yeah, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul. So they're making an attack on Paul. Well, Jesus had said in the vision, just a verse or two above him, no one will attack you to harm you. So they're making an attack on Paul. They are seeking his harm. But Jesus has promised no one's going to attack you and harm you. Harm is not going to come from any of the opposition that is coming your way. And so it's very interesting that right after Jesus makes his promise is put to the test. Or we have this scene that proves out the truth of the words of Jesus to Paul. Seneca really admired his brother and wrote of him as being a man who could not be swayed by flattery. He writes in one of his works saying, if one began by paying homage to his intellect, this is Seneca writing about his brother Gallio, the greatest and worthiest of all, which one had rather see consecrated to the service of heaven rather than wasted in weak human effort, he, Gallio, ran away from one who talked this way. Or if one began to praise his thrift, he was so indifferent to money that he seemed neither to possess it nor to condemn it. He cut short the very first words of the flattery. And so he's portraying him as a man who is fairly humble, but he was extremely well respected. Uh, He also said of Gallio, no human is so pleasant to any person as Gallio is to all, meaning that he has a favorable disposition to everybody. It does not include the Jews. Both Seneca and Gallio were anti-Semitic. They were anti-Jew. And this is a time, if you remember, verse 2 of chapter 18, Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome. This is a time when Roman suspicion against the Jews is at a peak. It's at a high point. We know of Gallio's. We can date it really well when Gallio took office because there's an inscription that has survived from Delphi, Greece, um, in the temple of Apollo in Delphi, that read Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. That's a mouthful. 12th year of tribunican power, acclaimed emperor for the 26th time, father of the country, sends greetings to, and it's obscured there. For long I have been well disposed to the city of Delphi and solicitous for its prosperity, and I have always observed the cult of the Pythian, that's Apollo. Now, since it is said to be destitute of citizens, as my friend and counsel, Lucius Junius Gallio, recently reported to me, and so he's naming him there in this inscription. He is a man who carries a lot of respect. If you are of a certain age, you might remember commercials that had the tagline, "When E.F. Hutton speaks, people listen." When Gallio spoke, people paid heed. His word carries a lot of weight. And so the Jews probably are aware of this, and they're going to bring Paul to his judgment seat to nip the problem of Paul in the bud. One of another Roman writer, Dio Cassius, wrote praising Gallio's wit. So he's a man of wisdom, he's a man of intellectual capability. He's not to be trifled with, as we see from the reading that we just did. The point of all of this here, introducing this man to you, is to note that Gallio was a man of renown. He was respected, and his word carried a lot of weight. And that becomes significant after he makes his declaration to the Jews. However, as I mentioned, he is anti-Semitic. His brother Seneca, in writing, spoke of the Jews as a most wicked nation, and Gallio also held that same opinion. But he's respected. His word carries weight. He's not like Pontius Pilate, the man who tried Jesus. Pontius Pilate was not respected by the by the Romans or the Jews. Even the Roman emperor who put him in office didn't like him. And so if Pontius Pilate says a thing, not many people are paying attention. When Gallio says a thing, many ears are attuned to him. I find it interesting, tangent time. I find it interesting that Luke, when he refers to Roman officials, he does it with tremendous accuracy. He's able to distinguish between senatorial and imperial provinces, which kept changing as one emperor would come into power. Let's take the uh, let's take the capital area of New York. You have Albany County, you have Rensselaer County, uh, and you have Saratoga County. Let's call those three counties. And uh, Emperor Bill Moore takes power over the state of New York, and he redistributes them. He says of Saratoga, you guys are way up north. You're just a community. Um, of Rensselaer, okay, you've got colleges there. You will be an imperial province. Schenectady, you'll be just a unit. In fact, Schenectady, you're going to join to Saratoga County, and we're going to form one new big province there. And of course, Albany is where the imperial capital is going to be. Bill Moore leaves office after 2 years, and Mike Hebert takes over as emperor of New York State, and he redoes everything. He redistributes everything. He puts new people in charge. Peter Archibald, who was in charge of Saratoga, he now moves him into Rensselaer and says, Peter, you need to go and take care of Rensselaer County. And he's going to appoint Leanne to go and take care of Schenectady or something. Names change and titles change. Peter might have been the president of Saratoga County, but now he's going to be the magistrate of Rensselaer County. Luke, at the time that he's writing, gets all of these changes and all of these titles correct. And in chapters 16, 17, and 18, he uses three distinct words when he's talking about the Roman leaders. In chapter 16, verse 19, After Paul has expelled the demon from the slave girl, when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. And when they had brought them to the magistrates, they said, "These men are Jews and they're disturbing our city," and so on and so forth. Luke is using a distinct word there, referring to the title of those individuals. The Greek word there is strategoi. They're the strategoses of the city. He refers in chapter 18 and verse 12 that Gallio is proconsul of Achaia. And we find another proconsul in Acts chapter 19 and verse 38 in Ephesus. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. And so you've got the strategoses in Philippi, you've got the proconsuls in Achaia, and then in Acts 17 and verse 6, you have the politarchs over Thessalonica, who are the men who Jason gets dragged before who when they're making accusation against Paul. But as I said, these titles changed. Provincial lines got redrawn. And Luke, at the time he is writing and in the time that he's speaking of these events, hits them all with accuracy. That tells me that the record that we have in Acts can be trusted. I've said before when people are talking about the Bible that the Bible is not a history book. Its purpose is not to teach us about the history of humanity. It talks about the history of the Jews, and it does mention historical events, and where it mentions history, it does so accurately. The Bible isn't a science book, but where it touches on the realms of science, it does so accurately. The Bible is a book that is detailing to us God's eternal plan and purpose to redeem humanity from our sin. That's its purpose. So when people say, well, the Bible is wrong about history, the Bible isn't a history book, but neither is it wrong about the history that it mentions. Or the Bible isn't a science book, or whatever other accusation that might be thrown against the Bible. The Bible has a very specific purpose. And I just find it interesting that Luke is so accurate here in keeping track of all the moving parts of the Roman Imperium and being able to stick the correct title on the individuals that he's writing about. So the Jews, when Gallio is proconsul of Achaia, and probably shortly after he takes office, they make this attack on Paul and they bring him before the tribunal. The tribunal is the Greek word there is bema. You see it again used in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10. We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. It's that same word, tribunal, judgment seat. It's this raised platform in front of the house of the proconsul from which he holds court and he makes decisions. This is in a public marketplace. And since there's nothing good on TV at the time, everybody's going to be in the marketplace, and everybody who's in the marketplace, when they see the commotion of this man being brought to the council, well, they're going to follow because this is entertainment. This is interesting. They want to see what's going on. And so a crowd is going to form. And all this that's transpiring is done so right out there in full view of everybody. Everybody's getting to hear these things, everybody's getting to see these things, and at the end of the chapter, people are going to act on these things. And so they bring Paul before Gallio, saying, look at the charge. This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. This is a very ambiguous accusation. Whose law? Contrary to whose law? The Jews mean the law of Moses and the traditions of their elders. I don't think they're hoping that Gallio understands that. The implication may be this man is teaching us to worship, is telling people to worship God contrary to Roman law, which is a horse of a different color. That's a serious matter, and one that Gallio would have to say something about. But he doesn't. So they make this accusation. This man is persuading, and that word persuading, Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 8. It's not persuading in a good way. It's persuading using deceit and trickery. Jeremiah 29, verse 8. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are among you deceive you, and do not listen to the dreams that they dream. It's the English Standard Version. It's the same word in the Greek Old Testament that's being used here. In other words, this man, Paul, is being deceptive in teaching people to worship God contrary to law. The Jews are obviously referring to Jewish law. Um, they the reference to God, worship of God, the word God there is singular, not gods plural like the Romans have. Um, and the reaction of Gallio makes it obvious that he perceives it that way too. And we know from verse 5 that of chapter 18 that Paul has been teaching that Jesus is the Messiah, which is at the heart of the Jewish non-believers' problem with Paul. He's teaching that the Messiah is Jesus, the carpenter who was put to death. And that can't possibly be true because God wouldn't let his Messiah be killed. And they don't believe that he's been raised from the dead. They're denying that. They've been blinded to that. I think the Jews are making, and this is my opinion, okay? Please understand this is my opinion. I may be reading more into the text than it can hold up, but I think the Jews are making their accusation intentionally vague in order to sway Gallio into thinking that Paul is offending against Roman religion, that Paul is teaching people to worship. Even the term God could probably be ambiguous here. That Paul is teaching people to worship in a way that's contrary to Roman law. Caesar, uh, which one? Claudius. Claudius had declared that Judaism was a lawful religion. That was an extremely major decision coming from the Roman government, acknowledging that the Jews had the right to um, hold to their traditions and perform their rituals and perform their rites undisturbed. You couldn't interfere with the Jews in their way of worship because they acknowledged this was a legitimate religion. And back to my illustration of Albany, New York being a Roman province and Bill Moore being emperor of it. If Peter Archibald comes in and there are 16 lawful religions on the books according to Bill Moore's law, and Peter brings in a 17th religion, Peter can be in trouble if he's preaching this without first getting authorization or approval from the governor to preach this new, not on our list, religion of authorized religions. And that still takes place today. There are places where you can't go and proclaim the word of Christ because it's unlawful to do so. And so I think that's what they're trying to persuade Gallio. Paul is teaching against the the Roman religion. He's preaching a new unauthorized religion. In either case, if Gallio bites on that, he would punish Paul at the very least and probably eject him from the city. So if they can shame Paul publicly, remember, crowd gathered around, they're all watching what's going on here and they're hanging on every word of this. If they can shame him publicly, and Paul loses face, then he's not going to be very effective as a missionary anymore. Nobody's going to listen to his message because he's been made a laughingstock. If he's punished, so much the better. If he's expelled from the city, no longer our problem. We're shut of him. And this Christianity thing will just dry up and blow away. So there's the accusation. Verse 14 says Paul was about to open his mouth. Paul's ready to jump into the breach here and say, wait a minute, let me say a thing or two. And Gallio cuts him off. Gallio shuts him down. Gallio closes down the argument by simply on the grounds that there is no case to answer here. And he makes the statement, and remember, verse 2, Claudius had commanded the Jews to leave Rome, and we talked about that. They were having theological debates, heated theological debates, probably over whether or not Jesus was Messiah. And so the Jews are on real shaky ground right now, that they know that theological debates and entering into theological debate can have dire consequences, both social and political consequences. But they bring this case before Gallio fairly convinced. Remember the opponents of Jesus. Every time they brought a situation to him, they were sure they had him. They were sure they had concocted a trap that Jesus could not escape. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? We caught this woman in adultery. The law of Moses says we stone her. What do you say? I mean, to quote Star Trek, what is it, the Kobayashi Maru, the unwinnable situation. They keep putting Jesus in these unwinnable situations, and Jesus keeps winning because he's a whole lot smarter than his opponents are. Paul doesn't even get to speak when Gallio says, wait a minute. No. If this was a matter, O Jews, of wrongdoing or vicious crime, that's an interesting word. That's a strong word that he uses there. It's used also in Acts chapter 13, verse 10, when Paul is speaking against Bar Jesus on the island of Cyprus. The English Standard Version says, you son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, full of deceit and villainy. That's the same word, villainy. Um, the NIV translates it as trickery. The New American Standard translates it as fraud. But it's a serious word. It's speaking of a serious crime. If this was a serious crime, vicious crime in chapter 18, verse 14, The NIV says serious crime. Uh, if it was a serious crime, then I would have reason to accept your complaint. Then you'd have a case. But instead, this is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law. He's saying this is an internal dispute. It has nothing to do with Claudius' earlier ruling that the Jews had the right to worship God according to their customs. Why? Because Paul's also a Jew. Paul is a Jew. They are Jews. They're squabbling about how to worship God. This is a Jewish problem. This is not a Roman problem at all. You guys go away. Leave. I don't want to deal with you. Now understand that Gallio wields considerable freedom to act as he sees fit. And the Jews right now don't currently have Rome's favor. And Gallio is known to be anti-Jewish in his prejudices. The Jews are on really, really, really shaky ground here. And Gallio sees through their wording of their accusation. And he responds, see to it yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things. NIV, I refuse to be a judge of these things. English Standard Version, I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters. New American Standard. In other words, no, you don't have a case. You take care of this yourself. See to it yourselves. And that final statement, that final declaration, I refuse to be a judge of these things. This is a really, really important decision from this man. It's it has bearing, long-reaching bearing for Paul and the church. It's important not only because it protects the Corinthian Christians in the province of Achaia and the entire province. Remember, he's proconsul over the entire province. So it's not just Corinth. It involves Greece and the other areas of Achaia as well. Excuse me. Need tea. So it protects the Christians in Achaia from legal cases against their beliefs and against the existence of the church there in it, churches in Achaia. The Christians will have the right to assemble and to worship according to their customs. But this is also the first time that a Roman official issues a legal verdict concerning the followers of Jesus. And because this is a respected Roman official, I mean, the pecking order of Roman officials, they had their own ranking hierarchy, but Gallio sits pretty near the top of that pile. Because it's Gallio who is making this decision, the Jews can't appeal to a higher court. There is no higher court for them. Understand? They could go to Caesar, but they're not going to fare very well there because currently Caesar, Tiberius, um, he likes Gallio. They're friends. Remember, I read that earlier in the inscription. They're friends. They're not going to fare well against him there. His judgment is such that these Christians should be regarded as a Jewish group, a Jewish sect, if you will. And as such, they would have the rights to the same legal privileges that the Jews had been granted by the other Roman emperors. They come, the Jews bring Paul to the seat of Gallio here, expecting, hoping to cause a lot of trouble for Paul. The ruling they get is the polar opposite of what they were hoping for, what they were anticipating. They end up securing for Paul Roman protection and the right for Paul to go and continue preaching, with the weight of the Roman Empire behind him saying, you have the legal right to do this. That's huge. Everywhere Paul has gone, he has faced opposition. He's going to continue to face opposition, but here in Achaia, his opponents won't have a legal leg to stand on. They won't be able to bring Paul before the magistrates and say, punish these guys, they're wicked men. Because word of this decree, word of this verdict will spread. You've got an entire crowd right here that's witnessed it. And word of mouth spreads really, really fast, faster than Twitter and the internet and Facebook do, it seems. Everybody's going to know. Everybody's going to hear about this. This is this is a tremendous boon for Paul. Remember what Jesus promised Paul. No one will attack you to harm you. The Jews attacked Paul. Remember what Romans 8:28 says, we know that in all things God works together for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. Here's an instant um, example of that truth. The Holy Spirit turns this on its ear, the accusation on its ear, and this works out for good. And so we're told that in verse 16, he drove them from the tribunal, that is, the Jews, probably Paul as well. Uh, Most likely it's his lictors, the soldiers who he has behind him. Gallio does not sit up there on his judgment seat without some authority. He's got the big guys with the big swords behind him, and they enforce his word. They will enforce his rulings. And to drive them out, that to expel them, suggests physical force, that he drives them from the in front of the judgment seat. And then we get to this confusing verse, verse 17. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio paid no attention to any of this. So the beating of Sosthenes is puzzling. The English Standard Version says they all seized Sosthenes. The NIV says then the crowd there turned on Sosthenes. The New American Standard says they all took hold of Sosthenes. The New Living Translation says the mob grabbed Sosthenes. I put my Greek Testament commentary over there in an effort to clarify, to help people understand late texts, late manuscripts, the Western manuscript and several others, helpfully inserted the words, the Greeks seized Sosthenes, to differentiate and tell us just exactly who the all is they're seizing this poor guy. So who beat Sosthenes and why? Some people suggest that Gallio's own lictors, his own soldiers, were the ones who issued the beating. Um, that's probably not very likely. That would have been an illegal action, and Gallio would certainly have had to say something. He would have lost face if he had allowed his own soldiers to beat the man there. Some suggest that it was the Jews who had dragged Paul there. They turn on their own leader, because now they've lost face. They've been made a laughing stock of in front of the tribunal, and they vent their anger on their own synagogue leader. I don't see that as, I mean, that doesn't help their standing or help their situation at all. Most of the commentators I read and most of other articles and whatnot I looked up suggest that it's the crowd. The crowd turns on Sosthenes. As the English, no, the New American Standard, New International Version, sorry. Then the crowd there turned on Sosthenes. The crowd turns on Sosthenes. The crowd is comprised of Romans and Greeks. Romans who are suspicious of the Jews, and the Greeks who are also suspicious of the Jews. Nobody seems to like the Jews very much. And they beat Sosthenes there in front of the tribunal, perhaps as a penalty for attempting prosecution in a deceptive way, perhaps as retribution for wasting the time of the proconsul. Whatever it is, the key here is the Gallio doesn't pay any attention to it, showing us the contempt in which he holds the Jews. And the irony here is, remember, the Jews brought Paul to Gallio in hopes of causing trouble for Paul. All they did was bring trouble on themselves. How many times in the Bible do we read of those who are trying to um, bring down God's people, have their own plans backfire and fall on them instead? Let me look at two. We've got time since we got through this a little bit quickly. Let's look at Daniel chapter 6. Everybody knows the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 to 24. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll read the first 5 verses. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom. There's another political office. It's not Luke writing about it, though. And over them 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And then verse 4, everybody else was jealous. They wanted to find grounds for complaint against Daniel in regard to the kingdom, but couldn't because he was too faithful. And then in verse 5, these men said, if we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. And so they concoct this scheme and they go before Darius and they say, oh, Darius, live forever. You're a wonderful king. In fact, you're so wonderful, we think you should make a law that nobody can pray to anybody or any God except you. Let's see. For the next 30 days, for 30 days, all prayer has to go to you. Darius is a vain man. They're stroking his ego. They're flattering him outrageously. And he thinks, boy, that's a great idea. And he writes the law and they say, we want you to sign this document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked in verse 8. And so he does that. And then these hooligans, they all go park outside of Daniel's window and they just sit there back with their popcorn and wait. Daniel knows, verse 10, that the decree has been signed. He went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. And they all see it. They run back to Darius and say, guess what? We found someone in violation of your law. Daniel's been praying to his God. You signed a law saying nobody can pray except to you for the next 30 days. Chuck him to the lions. Darius realizes that he's been trapped. And though he tries valiantly to uh, figure out a way to repeal this, is unable to do so. Verse 13, they answered and said, for the king Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction that you've signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And then the king, in verse 16, the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. I love that. May your God deliver you. Because I was a fool and I signed this letter, is the unwritten subtext there. The king spends the night fasting. He doesn't want any diversions or any entertainments. He doesn't sleep. He rises early the next day in verse 19 and went in haste to the den of lions. As they came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in an anguished tone of voice, or in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. Then look at verse 23 and 24. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. They tried to make trouble for the righteous man, and that trouble came back on their own heads. One other example, real quick. This one's a little shorter. It's only 2 chapters of the book of Ezra. Ezra chapter 5 and 6. Oh, let's see. Ezra 5, they're building the temple. The opposition in verse 3 comes and asks, who gave you the decree to build this house and finish this structure? What are the names of the men who are doing this building? And they get the names, and they send a letter off. The opponents of the Jews send a letter off to Darius, not the same Darius as Daniel in the lion's den, and says, "Hey, these guys are known troublemakers. You need to make a search of it, and you'll find that it's true. And they are building this temple against the law." Darius does a search. And in verse 17, it says that you make a search and let the king send us his pleasure in this matter, whether a decree of Cyrus was issued or not for the rebuilding of this house. We don't think so. These guys are bad guys. You need to punish them. Darius makes a search. The decree is found. And then in verses 6 and following of Ezra chapter 6, therefore, now Tattenai, governor of the province beyond the river, and all of your associates, keep away. Let the work on this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I make a decree regarding what you shall do for these elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of the house of God. The cost is to be paid to these men in full and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province from beyond the river. In other words, you guys are going to finance it. You guys are going to pay for the rebuilding of this house. Whatever is needed, bulls, rams, sheep for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, or oil, as the priests at Jerusalem require, let all let that all be given to them day by day without fail, that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. And I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of his house, and he shall be impaled on it. and his house shall be made a dunghill. May the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who shall put out a hand to alter this or destroy the house of God that is in Jerusalem. They made trouble for the guys who were rebuilding the temple, and that trouble came back on their own heads. I asked the question in Rome yesterday as we were discussing Psalm 125. Do we in the church, do we Christians enjoy the same protection from God that the people we read about in the Bible enjoyed? Of course we do. God still is a shield about his people, Psalm 3, verse 3. We're under God's protection, which means that we can go about fulfilling the command of Jesus to go into all the world and teach others about him and make disciples without fear because we have the protection of God. Now, that doesn't mean we won't have persecution. That doesn't mean that we might not lose our lives. What we won't lose is our salvation. That's guaranteed. Interestingly, Sosthenes, and we'll end on this because we're running out of time here. There is a Sosthenes mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1. And remember, this is taking place in Corinth. Sosthenes is the ruler of the synagogue. We've already had one ruler of the synagogue, Crispus. We read about him last week. He believed, he and his whole household, they became Christians. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 1, Paul, called by the will of God to be an apostle of Christ Jesus, and our brother Sosthenes, to the church of God that is in Corinth, to those sanctified in Christ Jesus. Possibly the same man. Possibly after getting beaten by the Jews and hearing the verdict that Paul was free to preach what he wanted to preach, maybe he gave some more serious consideration to the words of Paul. Maybe it's that same man who became a Christian. I don't know. There's no evidence one way or the other. I like to think that that's how it worked out because I like the happy ending in the story that Sosthenes ends up becoming a Christian because who wants to put up with abuse from the Jews or from the crowd and and suffer the humiliation like that. Next week, uh, Paul is going to leave Corinth and head back toward Antioch. We might finish the chapter, or we might get Paul as far as into at least getting a toe dipped into Ephesus. And then we'll spend a few weeks in Ephesus because the riot that goes on there is kind of interesting. That's where I'm going to stop the recording.